I'm Bill Dries with the Daily Memphian. This is one in a series of podcast interviews for our stories marking 50 years since the start of Plan Z busing for the racial integration of what was then Memphis City Schools. We're joined by Roshun Austin, who many of you know as the president and CEO of the Works Incorporated, and also from her work on the board of Memphis Fourth Estate, the nonprofit that is also the Daily Memphian. Today, she is here for a different reason. Roshun, you are a student in the Memphis City school system in the later stages of court-ordered busing. And your work as a leader of a community development corporation also offers some insight into the long-term impact of busing in Memphis. Let's start with you as a child. So busing, as I understand it from what you said, was a fact of life from the time that you started. Even though we're marking the 50th anniversary, you came into the school system in the later years when this was...
So I came into the school system in the mid-'70s.
Okay.
In kindergarten, I was able to attend my neighborhood school. So that was Shannon Elementary.
Okay.
But first through third grade, right in the middle of the experiment, I suppose, I was bused to Frazier, a few miles away to Grandview Elementary. I don't even think that's an elementary, maybe a charter now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. I think most of the schools in Frazier now are charter or achievement school district, and that we may be in the middle of another transition as we speak, as the ASD is phased out. So tell me, as a child, what was your impression of this thing called busing? Did you even distinguish that it was busing?
No. So, I knew I was going further away from home, and I had older siblings. So I had two older siblings who were also bused, but the oldest was able to attend Shannon. So she was, I guess she had to be in the 6th grade or 7th grade. So she ended up at Shannon and then Cypress, which was in our neighborhood or nearby our neighborhood.
Which was a separate junior high school.
Yeah, so she could still walk to school, but we were now getting up earlier because we had to get on a bus. And I think elementary probably started a little later then. It still does. I don't remember what time. Mm-hmm. I know it was after 8, but we had to get up earlier because we had to catch a bus to Frazier. And we had to make several stops to pick up other kids in the neighborhood. But as a young kid, you don't really think about busing in that way. In retrospect, I think about some of my experiences, which I also didn't know were maybe questionable or bad at the time. Mm-hmm. I was thinking about, my 2nd grade experience. It was the first time I probably was around white people at all.
Right, because Frazier, if people know Frazier today, Frazier then in the mid-1970s was still a predominantly white community or area at the time, right?
Yeah, it was probably my first experience with anyone white because there was no one white in my neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And so my teachers, 1st through 3rd, were all white teachers. And so it was a different experience for them, too, culturally, to have these kids coming from another neighborhood. And then it was the early 70s. People had their perceptions, and some people today have those similar perceptions. But I remember, and it's a story we talk about, my 2nd grade teacher. I remember her name. I won't call it. I remember all my teachers' names. But I was very shy and quiet. And so she assumed that meant I had a learning disability. And probably one of the only times my mom came to the school because of her work schedule, she wanted me tested. That teacher wanted me to be tested for special ed. And so I was tested, and I was in special ed, but I was in the gifted and talented program. Right. I just didn't talk, but I was bright. And so she had some assumptions that she said to my mom that your child needs some special attention. And so she had her own biases.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, she's extreme. My mom was thinking she's extremely bright. She just doesn't talk a lot.
Mm-hmm. Right. So how did the interaction among the children work at Grandview?
It still felt separate because, I have friends from my early childhood. I work with someone who went to kindergarten with me, and we walked to school together for years, and we even attended high school together later on. But she's Black, and so I can't remember establishing friendships outside of the core group that I rode the bus with from my neighborhood.
Because when you're in elementary school, the school day is kind of it. It's not like when you get into high school where you got all these other activities.
That's right.
That are connected to the school. It's like you're on the bus, you're in school, and then you're back on the bus and back to the neighborhood.
But sometimes, in elementary, people establish relationships and they have their friend, and if there's a sleepover, I know that would have been interesting. They may want to go even if they are not allowed to go to that sleepover. I don't recall that ever being offered. And I don't have any memory of the children who were not like me or not from my neighborhood from elementary, although I know tons of people from every other part of my life in school.
So was it strained? Did you pick up on anything as a child that indicated, ooh, this is kind of a tense situation?
I don't remember I would just remember certain episodes, so I remember in 1977, when Elvis died, because it was like the first day of school. It was August 16th. And I know that because my birthday is August 17th. And I remember certain teachers crying. I remember it was a sad time for them. It was really a sad time for the city, but particularly for certain people. I remember, now looking back, it's funny because I've traveled. My third grade teacher, who I absolutely loved, she traveled. So her family traveled during the summers and extensively. And she had obviously gone to South Africa. And there's a song that I know today that I will never sing again now that I know what it means. And it was a war song, really, the Boer Trek, marching to Pretoria. But I didn't know that until 2007. And I'm like, wait, that's the Boer Trek. That was, when the Dutch came into South Africa and warred with the Zulu. And I'm like, well, I should never be singing that again. But that's interesting that she taught us that song.
Yeah, because South Africa was at that point deep into the apartheid era. Yeah. Nelson Mandela was still in prison, still decades from being released from prison and becoming the father of what was a new South Africa.
Yeah. Yeah. And so it's those type of episodes that I remember now, looking back, that, hey, that was probably a little racist. But as a child, of course, I've not even heard of South Africa, so I don't know what that means. And it was a catchy song. So we're singing a war song. And I remember that from my childhood. Outside of, teachers' perceptions about our intelligence, I don't remember a lot of bad interactions with little kids, but remember I was the good kid too, so I didn't do a fighting and playground.
But one of the things that I've discovered in talking to some teachers who were integrated a few years before the buses started rolling is that there was none of the cultural training that you might have if that happened today. It was basically, okay, these are the kids, just go in there and teach like you would in an all-white school or an all-black school. And there was, it turns out that we know now it wasn't that simple, or it shouldn't have been that simple.
Oh, it wasn't that simple. So you may have had kids that were, they already were starting behind, depending on the neighborhoods they were coming from. I just was an exception. I wasn't the rule. And so I do think about with kids, and it was popular in the 70s to have, the groups, the reading groups. And so you think when you're in elementary school, you would read aloud. And so I remember mocking of some kids that were typically the blackbirds. And so you associated a blackbird with the kids that were a little further behind, and a blue jay was a kid that was bright. And so there were not very many black children that were blue jays. They were always labeled as blackbirds.
Okay. All right. So the way that these busing maps worked was you could be on one side of the street and you were bused. You could live on the other. You could know someone on the other side of the street, and they were not being bused.
So they would walk around the corner.
Yeah, they would just go around the corner, and you're up maybe an hour or two earlier than them to catch the bus to a school that you might pass several other schools on the way to. So what was it like when you got home? Did you compare notes about how are things going over at Shannon versus how are things at Grandview?
When they were at Shannon, their parents could attend their programs in the evening because often people didn't have automobiles. Almost every household has 2 cars now, but that wasn't true. So people rode the bus still in the 70s, or if you had a car. It was just one. And so if there was a dad and mom, one dad may have had the car. And so if your both parents were working, it was and they had multiple children, it was highly unlikely that they could make it to this community in a few miles away. If there was only one car and they had another kid that was doing a program around the corner, it was easier for people to go around the corner. So I do remember my parents, I don't remember them attending programs, especially not during the day, but certainly not even in the evening. Maybe a few parent-teacher conferences, but not often. And so I do remember that distinctly from my childhood that I blame it on the fact that I was the middle child, but I think it's mainly because of me being bused. They could not do both.
Right. And parents were built a little different in that era than they are now, and it's probably a difference because of the experiences from childhood of that. Because I don't remember parents being there for every ball game and everything like that, like they are now.
They probably have more flexibility with their jobs, and so the people in my neighborhood were probably pretty blue collar. So my dad worked in when he left Sears Crosstown, he worked in carpentry. He even worked in carpentry at Sears Crosstown. And at some point after like the 4th child, by the time my mom had her 4th daughter, it made more sense for her to stay home. So for 10 years of my childhood, in the early years of my childhood, my mom was a stay-at-home mom, but she didn't have the car. So she would have come, but it wasn't around the corner.
Right.
So she could walk to Shannon. It's just 3 blocks around. It was an easy walk.
Right. And we should point out to folks who don't know, Shannon is in North Memphis. It's the area where you're from.
Yes, I'm from Hyde Park.
Hyde Park, right. So were the other kids who weren't bused, were they curious about what was going on at Grandview, or were you curious about what was happening at Shannon?
I probably was. I don't remember them being so curious about Grandview. I was probably more curious about what was happening at Shannon because those were kids I also played with outside of school. And so, what's happening, it's kind of the neighborhood gossip among kids, what's happening in the neighborhood, because that school, they weren't as curious, I don't think, about Grandview. My sister, she's passed, but she was 3 years older than me. She got in trouble, so she was a fighter. And so her experience at Grandview, and we're talking, maybe she was 7. No, she had to be like 8 at the time. She got in trouble with the teacher, and so she was just tough. And so I don't know if she hit the teacher or what, but she got suspended and maybe couldn't ride the bus. This is a little 8-year-old girl walking down Rangeline Road. She was walking home from Grandview, which was on Whitney. And so I'm going to say it's at least 5 miles, but it's major streets.
Yeah.
And so she was attempting to walk home.
It's crossing the Wolf River over that bridge on Thomas, too. Wow.
Yeah. So and I don't know, how does she end up, out of the care of the teacher or teacher's aide? How did she get out of the school to walk down Rangeline Road? And someone saw her.
Yeah, man, that is so you rejoined the group of kids from Shannon, I take it later
in 4th
on.
grade.
Okay. And the fourth grade, you were back at Shannon, and Shannon, of course, is supposed to have white students who are bused into it.
There were never any white students at Shannon during my time there. I don't recall any white students. There were. I don't even remember a lot of white teachers. I'm trying to remember, was there any white teacher at Shannon? When I was in kindergarten, my teacher was white, but after that, I remember my Shannon elementary teachers, and they were black. The administration was black.
Because I'm assuming that if Grandview is paired and is getting students who are supposed to attend or were going to attend Shannon, I'm assuming that some Grandview students were assigned to Shannon.
To Shannon, and they probably just never came.
Right, which is the big undercurrent in the gap between what busing was meant to do and how busing actually wound up, because white flight was a huge thing. And Plan Z, we've talked about, had 39,000 students were involved in it by the plan. But I think in 1972, according to the statistics from Marcus Pullman's book, Opportunity Lost, you had 10,000 white students who were out of the system the year before the buses started, 40,000 by the first 4 years of it.
Wow.
So, yeah. Wow. Let's talk about adult life now.
Okay.
And so when did you start to see a connection between the conditions that you encountered as a child and what you have worked with at Works Inc. to change in those neighborhoods? You're involved in the renovation of Northside High School
yeah.
and the surrounding Klondike neighborhood as well. So, did you see a connection right off the bat, or did it occur to you right off the bat?
So long before I joined the Works, which is about 11 years ago, I worked in community development for the last almost 29 years. And so when I started out when I was in graduate school in the, like I said, it was the mid-90s, I was assigned to work in the Douglas community. So it was right next door. And part of my job wasn't at a community development corporation, but it was at the schools, and it was like the resource center, a family resource center at the school. I think Jerry House was the superintendent at the time, and there was an effort to put these resource centers in certain schools, and Douglas was one of those. Well, my mom, when she moved to Memphis from the Boo Hill, graduated from Douglas. And naturally, I would have been assigned to Douglas based on where I lived, but by the early 80s, it had closed. Mm-hmm. So the building had closed, and I would have been bused to another community, Kingsbury, which was more white. And so I started to connect this decline in residents because people were looking for opportunities for their families, and certainly for their children. They wanted better for their children. So even if they were bused, they still wanted if they had any access to resources or increase in income, they moved out. So you start to see people moving out of, and I was looking at several communities at the time, moving out of Hyde Park and the Douglas community and Hollywood and Springdale and all the communities nearby because they were a little more affluent. And so they moved further east. And later when I was at Orange Mound a few years later, you see the same thing happening in Orange Mound. They're moving into Cherokee and Sherwood. And so those schools that had once been white and not that long before started, so they were losing students at Melrose, and Douglas had already closed, to those schools that were new to them, like Sherwood and even further east as you went up to Ridgeway and into the county school system. And so because people were moving and nobody was replacing them, or either you were leaving the most vulnerable people in neighborhoods. So they were either senior without a lot of discretionary income, or the lowest income people who had no opportunity to move. You start to see this decline in population, decline in how the governments are investing in infrastructure. So the conditions in public parks and the roads are bad. There's no reinvestment there. Houses are becoming vacant and abandoned. And then you start to see, especially in the early 80s, throughout the 80s, honestly, crime. So I watch us going from a safe-ish neighborhood in the 70s to a very high crime neighborhood. And a lot of that was related to drug sales.
Right.
And
vacant houses.
So you were attracting vacant, abandoned houses. Nobody, if a house burned out, nobody was knocking it down. It was just there. Overgrown lots. It's just a lot. I saw the decline in Hyde Park, in Douglas, in Orange Mound, in neighborhoods throughout the city.
Right. And the Douglas community did a really extraordinary thing because the school closed, and for years, loyal alum of Douglas High School fought and spoke out, and eventually a new Douglas High School was built in that area. But I think people have to keep in mind that the white students who were bused to that school and to other schools didn't show up. It wasn't like the school could say, oh, okay, because you still had black kids who lived in the neighborhood, who as long as they lived in the neighborhood at their homes, they were to go to another school. They couldn't really go back to Douglas under that busing assignment unless it was in a future grade level.
Yeah. So, a lot of things were happening, so the white students never went. And like I mentioned, the more affluent black families were moving out anyway. And so, the fact that I'm working on my third former school building or lot for a different redevelopment now. So I think Commissioner Woods told me I'd be the person that bought the most school buildings or lots for some redevelopment purpose. And the fact that some school if you think about Northside, it's a state-of-the-art school built in 1966 by the system. It's 300,000 square feet. It was huge. At the time, it was the biggest high school. It had a gun range and mechanic shop and
a print shop.
And we still have the big print machine. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I just think I should keep it.
And you have an 1,800-seat auditorium that actually you're going to have to downsize. Yeah.
Great acoustics. It was just a beautiful school. And they, think about the investment, but then think about this same school built in 1966. And by 2016, it's closed in the middle of a neighborhood. And then at the same time, our partnership, we're able to pick up a third of the parcels in this neighborhood because they're vacant and abandoned or they're for sale for some reason. Imagine that a group can come in and buy the school that is now empty, 300,000 square feet, and it's surrounded by civic assets. It's a library, community center, an aquatic center, and then there's a school next door.
Klondike Elementary.
Yes, and now Perea is housed there, charter system. And, you're right, near downtown. All of these things are true about Klondike, but it's vacant and abandoned. There are less than 600 families in Klondike proper, not counting Smoky City or Valentine Evergreen. Just Klondike has less than 600 families and more than 1,200 parcels, and we are able to own a third of those because of vacancy and blight.
And Northside was put there for a reason. The school system didn't just decide, let's build a school there and see if something develops around it. There was a thriving community around that school, which I remember seeing because Northside was paired with Westside High School in Fraser. And so before the details of the maps were released, they took a group of us, several groups as it turns out, over to Northside to see it. And we come from what was the smallest high school in the school system at the time. Some people had larger graduating classes than the entire school at Westside. And Northside was one of those places. And it was absolutely overwhelming to see not only that school and what it was built for, but also to be in that community at the time and to see it really in full bloom. And so your hope is that can happen again, even though Northside won't
It won't be a school officially. No, we have some training and some school aspects, but it won't be a Memphis and Shelby County school system school or even a charter. I often when just thinking about schools in our county, and I think about towns, and I always talk about in community development about Collierville, and then I use them kind of as a beacon. And Collierville, for a decade or more, was one of the fastest growing towns in the U.S., not just in Tennessee. And so I say they built a town and then they built a school because it generally should happen that way. And now that school is probably overcrowded because they put in everything else that you needed to create a town before they put that institution. What's happened with neighborhoods like Douglas and New Chicago and even the area around Carver, yes, there was a lot of nostalgia that got schools rebuilt. But if we ride our bikes off and going to MLK, Riverside, which is cut off, a lot of racist things happen around there with redlining and the interstate highway. We can ride through that area in Riverside and there are whole streets of vacant lots. And so it doesn't suggest that school needed to be there again right now until we built the neighborhood.
Well, and also it raises questions about, is there too much weight put on the schools? Because the schools are built because of a population
people yes.
need. I mean, that's why they're not necessarily there strictly to help develop a community, but at school closing hearings, which I've been to a ton of them, you would always hear it, don't close our school. If you do, it's a death sentence for our neighborhood.
But if they look around, the death sentence happened years before. And it's a beacon of hope for them, perhaps, and they have a memory of that school from its heydays. But the neighborhood, by the time a school closes, that means it's, people are not living there who have school-age children, or if they do, they're choosing to go somewhere else.
Right.
Or send their children somewhere else that they think is better for their child. Because we all want what's best for our children and our families. That doesn't end when you enter into a low-income neighborhood. So they want what's best. And just because you have nostalgia about this place doesn't mean today that parent thinks that's best for their child. And so I know it's probably not, it's a controversial opinion, but I think you build neighborhoods and cities and towns before you build institutions like school. It's not building a school and things will come. We're developers, especially in the housing space. You build the housing and then the school comes. And I think we've had that backwards in terms of investment. I'm not trying to advocate taking money from the schools, but I think we need to add more money in neighborhoods or we won't have successful schools.
Right. And you're also involved in one of the apartment complexes around MLK Prep, which used to be Fraser High School. And I take it that decision by you what was based in part, at least, on what's been going on at MLK Prep with Bobby White's leadership over there and the school really.
And the elementary school next door.
Right.
So, we ended up in Fraser because we weren't, as an organization, working in Fraser at the time because of an investment by philanthropy in charters, in particular those schools. And so we kind of drew a map 2 square miles around MLK, and it's our MLK Fraser initiative. And so we already developed 146 units across the street, kind of diagonally across from the high school as a part of the initiative. And we're scheduled to do another 79 units of senior housing directly facing the high school. And then there will be a third phase, which we haven't decided what type of housing that is. We know we won't compete with ourselves on garden style apartments. We won't compete on senior housing, so it has to be some other affordable. It'll be affordable. We do know that.
Right. And others are working in that immediate area too. Girls Inc.
There are a lot of initiatives, and then there's the early ed with Porter Leaf just a quarter of a mile away. And so there's another school with Memphis Business Academy very close by. And so there's all kind of investment in that Fraser, or what we call the MLK prep zone. But, so I guess unknowingly kind of entered into this anchor-based strategy around schools or taking a school that was an anchor of a community and converting it to a mixed-use function like North Side based on what residents in the neighborhood say they need. And then in South Memphis even, we Lincoln Junior High, which was really the original Southside High, was demolished in 2003. The land is set vacant. And so we acquired that from the school system to build an open plan subdivision. So that's why Commissioner Wood said I'm going after all the school, and I have a closed bid in for some more school land.
Mm-hmm. You also, I think in going through Northside High School before the renovation work and readaptation of the school began, I think you had kind of an aha moment because you found, and I saw the same thing in the library, some of the old class pictures from Northside High School, which had some degree of integration at the outset, which is surprising to a lot of people.
Yeah,
I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I mean, think about the time. It was 66, so it's mid 60s. There were a lot of efforts around integration happening already that happened years before. With the Memphis 13 to integrate the school system was a few years before that, and so it wasn't just about Klondike. Although people in Klondike, it's too small of an area for that high school that size to have just been meant for Klondike. It was probably meant for the Smoky City neighborhood, which it's black now, but Smoky City clearly was not black if Elvis went to Hume's. Because our public housing wasn't integrated in the 40s and 50s, in neighborhoods were not that integrated. And so even if he were poor white, he still was not in an integrated system. And so Smoky City was not really a black neighborhood. It's become that, which is what happened across the city. Cherokee wasn't, but a lot of places were not black. Even Barron Heights, which now Orange Mound owns, it's just a part of Orange Mound, was, I have a friend, she's in her early 80s. She was the first, her and her husband were the first to integrate Barron Street in 1961 or so. And so, but if you're not that old or somewhere close, you don't know that. And you think your whole life has always been black.
So knowing those market forces, redlining the practices that are still used to some degree today, what was busing up against some forces that just focusing on the school system alone couldn't overcome?
That's a great way to talk about it. Yeah. So you can't overcome federal policy that is intending to really just shut down neighborhoods, that these are forgotten people. We don't need to invest in them. I mean, if you separate, and I said in a TED Talk, I said we use concrete barriers like in interstate highways to separate neighbors. And you see it in Klondike, the interstate, which wasn't there before at some point.
You can see north side from the interstate.
You can see north side from the interstate. And certainly people didn't build their houses under interstates. So in the 50s, when the interstate started, through the country, you see the redlining maps look almost identical to the interstate highway maps. And I know this for Memphis because I've overlaid them. And so it was very intentional. And I call it a collusion by academics, the federal government, and the financial sector.
Right. So the busing, even though it may not have been the intent of the effort, busing had some very significant unintended consequences.
It did. I got in trouble for this in graduate school. I took a course called Anthropology and Education. And I quoted George Wallace, of all people for me to quote. But it was meant to, be controversial when I said segregation now and segregation forever. And it was the start of my conversation about what happened to neighborhoods, and particularly the less affluent black neighborhoods in Memphis as a result of this forced integration that people really didn't abide by. They formed private institutions, and if they could afford to go there, they went there. Parochial schools popped up and they went there. And it left the most vulnerable in the neighborhoods. And then you separated families, and you had kids that may have been acting out, parents who couldn't visit because they didn't have automobile transportation or they were working late hours. They were hourly. And so I won't blame the school integration. It's the breaking of the family, but to some degree it did. You saw the breaking up of families and neighborhoods as a result of the integration. You know, ideally we want to have an integrated society, but sometimes attempts by government to force things don't always work.
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, we've had in one of our other interviews with Marcus Pullman, who again wrote the book on this really in some detail. He speculated about what would have happened if there had been voluntary integration or one-way busing, which is kind of what the experience wound up becoming.
Anyway, yeah.
You know, if maybe 5 years of that would have prompted white parents to put their kids on buses after that and say, okay, I don't know. And he acknowledged it's kind of a very theoretical.
Yeah, because I mean, it's larger than any one system or city. It's what was happening in the U.S. in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And I said, perhaps since it was one way, maybe we should have considered wraparound services for the families that did experience that one way, because they were leaving places that didn't have a lot of, we had assets, but not financial assets. And so they needed some more supports when they left on those buses in the morning. So
here we are half a century later, and the story continues. People continue to talk about the effects of this policy versus what the intent was. I mean, does anything this audacious, do you think, ever wind up doing what it set out to do?
I'm trying to think of an occasion when it happened in American history because I went to pretty segregated schools my entire time. Even in high school, when I rode 2 city buses to get to my high school, I still lived in Hyde Park, but I attended East High School. I can name the 5 or 6 white people who graduated with me, whose parents, took a chance on this school, which was a very affluent white school before. But, once kids from Binghamton and other kids across the city came, and what brought East back at that time, I was the first wave of kids in the optional program.
Right. Which was Dr. Willie Harrington as school superintendent, taking aim in some cases at the private schools that had popped up and saying they're just about on the edge. If we do this, we can draw back some measure and shut them down. You
only drew very few back into that system because I was a separate Shelby County system and a Memphis City school system, and it looked very different. Mm-hmm. So Memphis City schools, for the most part, outside of Central and White Station and the 5 people at East were black. It was a black system.
Mm-hmm. All right. That is where we will leave it, past and present, in our conversation. We've been talking with Roshun Austin about Plan Z and its aftermath 50 years later. Hard to believe that.
I know.
I'm Bill Dries. This is the Daily Memphian.